Tēnā koutou, tēnā koutou, tēnā koutou katoa. Nau mai, haere mai, welcome to the 2024 University of Auckland Early Childhood Seminar Series, April Seminar. We'll begin our time together with karakia. Me enoi tātou. Tū taua mai I runga, tū taua mai I raro, tū taua mai I roto, tū taua mai I waho. Kia tau ai te mauri tū, te mauri ora, ki te katoa. Haumi e, hui e, hai ki e. Thank you for joining us for today's presentation by Professor Maria Birbili from Aristotle University of Thessaloniki in Greece. We're delighted to have Maria visiting us here in New Zealand and grateful for her willingness to share her current research on children's question asking and how we can encourage independent and meaningful learning. Besides offering this early childhood seminar series, the University of Auckland also offers a range of early childhood focused courses. Sorry, I'm just trying to show you what they are. Here we are. And programs of study, including a new Masters of Education Early Childhood specialisation. This flexible program is tailored for teachers, researchers, social workers and more, and leads from postgraduate certification to a master's degree. A University of Auckland Master of Education Early Childhood will equip you with sought-after skills, including critical thinking and advocacy for diverse communities. In Semester 2 this year, the core course EDUC 767 Childhood Studies will be offered online and on campus, which is a great jumping off point for the degree. I will now hand over to Professor Helen Hedges to welcome and introduce Professor Maria Birbili. Thanks, Helen.
Kia ora, Justine, and tēnā koutou katoa. It's my pleasure to introduce my colleague and friend, Maria. Maria is multilingual and a seasoned traveller, having completed her master's degree in Boston in the USA and her PhD at Oxford University in England. She returned to her home country of Greece to take up her present position in 2002 at Aristotle University, and who wouldn't want to work at a place with such a great name? As her seminar flyer implied, Maria has never forgotten her roots as a teacher. So much of her research program explores teachers' and children's interactions, teacher decision-making about curriculum and pedagogy, and teachers' active contributions to both. Hence, her presentation today focuses on teachers' and children's questions. This topic is of direct relevance and interest to us in enacting Te Whāraki, given our focus on teachers supporting children's working theories and encouraging learning dispositions such as curiosity and perseverance. So we're very curious about your presentation, Maria, and look forward to hearing from you. Over to you.
Thank you, Helen. Thank you, Justine, for both the invitation and the warm welcome. It's great to be here again, Helen, at the seminar series at the School of Education and Social Work, and in my favorite country, if you allow me to say that. And thank you also for giving me the opportunity to talk about a topic that is really close to my heart for years now. As you said, Helen, children's questions. I need to start by saying that the project I'm presenting here was made possible with the generous support of the Froebel Trust in the UK. And I want to say that the selection of this funding source was not random. You see, Froebel, and I'm sure everybody knows that, like other influential pedagogues, strongly believed in children's questions. For Froebel, children's questions are a sign of intense mental activity. And this intense mental activity is visible from very early on. If we just think babies, how babies ask questions with their gaze, how they ask with their puzzled look. Froebel also believed that children's questions can teach not only children, but also adults, if only, that's the condition, if only adults let themselves follow children's questions. So for me, these are powerful thoughts, and I believe you will agree with me that those are also contemporary ideas. So knowing all these and having read Froebel from my student years, it made sense to me to apply for funding from the Trust, and I was very lucky to get it. So the study I will present here aim to explore how early childhood educators can improve young children's question asking for learning. Sorry about that. I want to stress asking for learning because questions can serve many purposes. And here we're focusing on helping children to ask questions for learning. Why this aim? First of all, because we know that well-formulated questions and knowing what questions are worth asking are at the heart of being autonomous and learners and decision makers. From Froebel to the Greek curriculum to the New Zealand curriculum, I think you will agree with me, this is an important goal of contemporary early childhood curricula. Secondly, we know that also that while it is important for us teachers to know how to ask good questions, I dare say that it's even more important to help children understand the importance of asking questions for learning and to support them to improve their own questions. So, in other words, children need to understand for themselves that some questions are more effective than others, and that asking with a purpose, not just for the sake of asking, leads to a deeper and more meaningful learning. Now, when we are discussing question asking, we also know from the literature that to ask for more effective questions, children need to have certain conditions. Okay, so we know that they need adults who act as good role models of question asking, of the quality of questions and all that, and I'll talk about that in a minute. They need environments, they need strategies, and they need materials that open up opportunities for curiosity. Curiosity and questions are very closely linked. They need opportunities for open-ended play, open-ended materials that provoke questions, that provoke curiosity, and they need opportunities for inquiry learning, which, as you know, it has at its heart questions. Children also need a safe environment to pose their questions. That means, there are no silly questions, as sometimes we used to hear when we were young, my age. And of course, they need, and like all of us when we learn something, they need feedback on their efforts. So in order to explore how early childhood teachers can support children to improve their questions, we chose to focus on exploring the impact of two strategies. There are many strategies, but we focused on those two. The first was teacher as a model of question generation, and the second was explicit instruction of question asking. So to put it differently, what we wanted to do in this study was to see how does the use of these two strategies support children in asking better questions. I have to say that both these strategies, and you might know that, are mentioned in the literature, in the relevant literature, but there seems to be limited empirical evidence on how they work in early childhood education. So we felt that we had a gap that we could work on. Now, allow me to say a few words about the two strategies before I say more about the project. Sorry, I'm doing silly things. Okay, so teacher as a model of question generation. Behind this strategy, for us, there was Froebel's concept of imitation. He calls it children's faculty of imitation. And what it means is that, as Froebel argued, children observe and inevitably imitate those things that are in direct and close relationship and real relationship, as he says, to them. So according to this proposition, if this is what is happening, we, let's say, accept that, imitation can be used by teachers as an instrument for assisting children to formulate their own concepts, to understand what is going on around them. Now, for me, the most important thing that I would like you to keep in mind when you hear me talking about imitation and later on is that we do not talk, when we talk about imitation, we do not talk about a static process. This is what Froebel believed, and I'm sure you know that this is also Vygotsky, what Vygotsky believed. It is not a static process. It is not just copying. It is not something that leads to mere reproduction. Children see and they do exactly the same thing they see. It is actually a very dynamic act. It's an act that leads, the literature says, to self-transformation. And it is an act, and I'm borrowing Jane Murray's word here, that includes restructuring, includes recreation, and leads to new experiences. So here we can say that there is a strong social side in imitation, and you will see what I mean later on. It's a deeply social process. So that's important to keep in mind, because I know that imitation is, probably loaded sometimes with negative ideas. The second strategy we used, explicit instruction for question generation, also resonates with the importance placed by Froebel on adult guidance combined with emergent learning. Here, I would like to say that if someone is not familiar with the term or probably got scared by the idea of explicit instruction in early childhood education when I first mentioned it, I think Archer and Hughes' definition is very helpful. And so when we talk about explicit instruction, we actually talk about a series of supports, as they say, a series of scaffolds. And what is at the heart of explicit instruction is clear statements, is clear explanations, and supported practice with feedback. So you see, it's not, even though it has the word instruction, it's not that, starting teaching and not stopping, as we say. So in that sense, explicit instruction can be part of a balance of deliberate teaching. I think that's also the word that is used in the Fariki, intentional teaching, and spontaneous learning. So that's what, what we had in mind when we chose our strategies. Now let's talk about the project. Participants, one early childhood educator, Iphigenia. You will hear me saying we a lot, so because we work with Iphigenia on that. Iphigenia has many years of experience. She's very much interested in relationships in the classroom, her relationship with children themselves, between them, and very interested in improving her practice. And I'm really grateful to her because she said yes from the first moment I mentioned the project to her. 23 children and their families, me, all that in a public kindergarten with children 4 to 5.5 years old. That's how it works in Greece. In Thessaloniki, in the city of Thessaloniki, and the project took place from February till July. Now, we collected evidence through Iphigenia's observations, her field notes, and recordings of critical incidents. They were really important for us, and I think you will see later why. Lots of audio recordings of classroom dialogues, Iphigenia's interviews with individual children when she felt that she needed to probe for more information, for their thoughts, documentation of children's learning, which is anyway part of the standard practice in Iphigenia's classroom, and lots of samples of children's work, and you will see some in this presentation. Data analysis, I can come back if you want me to talk, but for now I would like to say that, as you can imagine, it was a process of continuous meaning making, a lot of dialogue with data, lots of conversations with Iphigenia, and definitely, I have to say, a challenge for us, mainly because we were looking for changes in children's questions, and change, as you know, can be infused in all classroom practices. It does not wait for you to happen in one moment, in 1 minute, one place. And that means, as Iphigenia said, that you need to have your eyes everywhere. But it was a very worthy experience. Phases of the project, we have in the first, it had 4 phases, the project, with each one lasting 1 or 2 months, depending on the rhythm of the classroom, children's interest, and the everyday life of the classroom. It was clear from the beginning that we will not have, we will not impose on children changes, if they were not ready. So there was no hurry to do anything. The first phase, we started by recording both Iphigenia's and children's questions. And this was done not only for research purposes, that is to have like the before and after picture, but also it is very clear, because it is very clear in the literature that if you want to improve question asking in your classroom as a teacher, you need to have a clear picture of your own question asking skills and behavior, as they say in general. During the second phase, Iphigenia acted as a model, or two things, if I can say. A, the role of questions in learning. When and why do we ask questions? And B, a model for productive questions. And I will explain all those things in a while. In the next phase, in the third phase, the class engaged in a project titled Questions in Our Lives. Here I talk about the project approach, which is very popular in Greek early childhood centers. And this is the time, the third phase, that Iphigenia also used explicit instruction to alert children to the use of questions. And the fourth and last phase, children were encouraged to reflect on their experiences and decide how they want to celebrate their learning. And again, the idea, the concept of celebration, we borrow from the project approach, which says that at the end, children celebrate, what they have learned. Now, let's see what happens in each phase in more details. We started with observations. And so our first observations told us that children in the beginning asked mainly procedural questions, that is routine questions, questions about classroom management. And the second most frequent category were factual questions, like what is that? Where does that go? We observed that they phrased their queries in indirect speech. So when Iphigenia asks, what would you like to ask? Children may say to ask what the bunny eats, which was a big surprise to us because, we have in our mind that, and we know that children from very young, they ask really proper questions, but that was really interesting. We observed that they repeated each other's questions and Iphigenia's questions. And as Iphigenia noted at the time that they seemed to like the ask of asking, but they didn't really pay attention to the answer. Sometimes they were saying, I want to ask something, and then they were going on making an observation or a statement, but it wasn't a question. And sometimes they asked questions that were not useful in the specific context. And Iphigenia also recorded that she did most of the questioning, that first phase in the classroom, and that she asked both open-ended and closed-ended questions, that is, questions that had more than one answer, or closed-ended questions, questions that had a specific answer. I have here the show and tell clip art because I wanted to remember to tell you that many of these observations came from a routine that Iphigenia had every Friday, where children were presenting their favorite toy. And as you know, question asking is at the heart of show and tell. So observations in this context were very useful for us, very helpful. And I have to say that they remain helpful across the project because very soon that context, the show and tell context, was the one that we could see changes more clearly. So to summarize the observations from the first phase, children seem to have a difficulty at all stages that the literature talks about when we talk about question generation, which is initiating a question, formulating a question, and expressing it. Here I have an example of how children phrase their queries during phase one. And this example comes from a parent's visit to the kindergarten. It was Nefeli's mother who came to talk about the bunny they had at home. And Iphigenia asked children to think in advance questions they would like to ask Nefeli's mother during the visit and to write them or draw them, depending on what they wanted to do. So this is an example. What would you like to ask Nefeli's mother? I want to know that it eats carrots. And Iphigenia insists, how would you like to ask this? Does it eat carrots? And that's the drawing. Now, during the second phase, one morning, Iphigenia, during circle time, tells the group that she loves questions. She starts working as a model, okay? And she starts asking them about, whether they remember her asking questions, what type of questions she asks, whether they ask questions. So what we have here is a discussion, first of all, Iphigenia expressing her relation with questions, okay? And then asking children to remember their own relation with questions. From that day onwards, also we discussed with Iphigenia what she did. She started thinking aloud, which is another strategy that I really believe in. It's not used only about questions, but she started thinking aloud about questions and her own question asking. For example, when she wanted to ask children something, she will say, now that you said that, a question came to my mind. Thinking aloud is a strategy that the literature tells us that allows the non-expert to witness what is in the head of the expert, let's say, of the more experienced person. So, for instance, he was saying also, I'm wondering what is that? I'm wondering where, we could go. Or she was sometimes saying, now I will ask you a difficult questions and I would like you to think before you give me an answer and all that. So she was acting as a model and she was thinking aloud. Now, during that time, Iphigenia starts talking about questions. We observed that children still kept repeating their peers' questions, so asking the same question repeatedly. That was especially in the show and tell context. But we also observed that they were getting better at distinguishing between I want to say something and I want to ask something, which, if you remember, I said that in the early stages, they couldn't distinguish, they couldn't make this distinction. And they were asking a question. When they were saying, can I ask you a question? They were actually asking a question. And as Iphigenia noted, children seem to have become more alert in the role questions played in Iphigenia's classroom. She said, as she wrote, it was as if they have piqued her interest in questions. And as a result, we're thinking, we can discuss that, they started reported experiences from home. So they had the context of questions, they were thinking about questions. It was very much part of learning the idea of questions. So they started making connections. Where else have I seen questions? Where else have I heard any questions? So they started reporting experiences from home. But Iphigenia, in the context of academic learning, let's say, when it comes to academic content, Iphigenia observes that she still does the questions. She still does the question asking. Okay, children ask less questions in this context. So there seemed to be a change, but in some contexts, not all of them. Here's a critical incident that Iphigenia records, and you will see why I call it critical incident. So we have Vasilis here, who during free play shares with Iphigenia a home experience about a game he plays at home, especially with his grandfather. So there's a dialogue, so it's a big one, but I think it's a good example. He says, Miss, can I tell you something? Yesterday I played with some cards that had questions and I found them all. I have found the answers. Iphigenia asked, was it a questions with was it a game with questions? Sorry. He says yes. And then Iphigenia asks for an example. And he says it's something wild and it punches. What is it? It's a kangaroo. That's interesting, Iphigenia says. But then she says, does that game have questions? That reminds me of a riddle. Does it have riddles? And Vasilis remembers that, and he knows the difference between question and riddles. And he says, yes, it has riddles. And then Iphigenia goes on to ask him, to tell him, would you like, how would you ask this? Can you ask a question? And Vasilis says, he wants to try. And he says, what is it that it is wild but it's not one of these wild animals. I tried to translate it and stay closer to the child's language. Sorry about that. And that was a question, and the answer was a bear. So what is it that is wild, but it's not one of these wild animals? This is a bear for you to remember next time. Okay. So what follows the incident is this. As they listened to the dialogue between Iphigenia and Vasilis, other children began to raise their hands in order to pose a question about animals. And also, after 3 days, Vasilis brought the game to school, and after he presented it to the group, Iphigenia grasped the opportunity and asked them whether they would like to create their own game of questions. And that was a really good moment. It was the beginning of like a number of moments, as I write here, and activities devoted to write questions and creating cards with questions and playing question games. That was, a change. And they started asking questions, as we said with Iphigenia, non-stop. So children were picking up their interest, and they were saying, okay, for instance, here we have a child who says to Iphigenia, he really likes snakes. He was reading about snakes, and he says, I want to write a question about snakes. Have a look, though, how he writes the question. The question he writes is, snakes have poison to protect themselves from people. And then when Iphigenia says, what do you want to ask? He says, if they do it, if they have poison. And then he goes on, say, I don't know how to write questions, only regular stuff. And that was really, really interesting answer he gave. Here again, there's another example of children being in the mood of asking questions, of having started to ask questions. And here we have, I don't know if you've heard that, there was a train crash, really bad train crash in Greece in last March. And the children had many questions because there were many things going around because of this event. So they asked Iphigenia, what does it mean they collided? Because they could hear in the news that trains collided. And here you can see the answer. And that is because as they started creating cards with questions, Iphigenia encouraged them at some point to also think of the answers, either individually or in groups, and record them at the back of the card. And as Vasilis said, it was just like the game. So they had the model, the game that Vasilis brought to classroom that had the question, and then at the back had the answer. So they began doing the same thing. They started doing the same thing after Iphigenia's suggestion. So that is the answer about the trains. What follows in phase 3? Which, if you remember, I said the aim was to help children think in a more focused way about questions and why people ask questions. The main aim of this phase was to help them, what I mean by saying that in a more focused way, mainly why people ask questions, what type of questions people ask, and where do they see questions in their lives. So this is when she uses explicit instruction to introduce children to the question words, why, how, where, and different types of questions. And she also encourages them to explore why people ask questions and what we can do to find the answers to our questions. And this is where we use the project approach, as I said before. During this phase, Iphigenia also introduces a series of questions, question games, suggested in the relevant literature. And that was, let's say, a playful way to engage children in different kinds of questions and the different kinds of thinking they provoke. So problem solving, imaginative thinking. And again, I will show you some examples in a minute. Key activities in phase 3. Children investigate why people ask questions. They become journalists and they ask their parents and other members of their family. The group decides to play questions games every Monday and Wednesday. They're very much into games of questions by now, as you understand. And they also suggest to Iphigenia that she asks every Friday these strange questions. What if? Examples in a minute. And also a diary sent to parents asking them to record if they want, and they have the time, it was on a voluntary basis, record children's questions outside school, like at the home environment. We really wanted to see whether children are in the same mood, let's say, when they get out of school, and what kind of questions they ask, whether they take the interest from the classroom to the home environment and all that. And that is the diary we sent. That's a form, and it says on the top, he or she asked, and then in the box, a few informations, what was the context. What happens in that phase with all those things going around? Some interesting observations. When Iphigenia asks, why do people ask questions? Most children say that we ask questions in order to learn stuff. So that shows that, you know, they're making the connection between questions and learning. Interestingly, when she asks, how do we know when someone is asking a question? Children are having a difficult time answering this question. So the answer that came from nearly all the children is because, we know because they ask, they couldn't identify any elements that make a question. And then when Iphigenia introduces the question words and asks children to think of questions that begin with why and how and where, all that, we observed that this was not an easy task for children. And I think we learned a lesson from that. It was not easy because we were asking children actually to ask a question out of a specific context without a clear purpose. And I think it's also difficult for us. If I was to say, could you ask a question that starts with why? I think we would have the same difficulty, even though we would do it. But it was more difficult for children. So that was a good lesson for us. Why people ask questions? These are some of the answers children brought back from their families. And as you can see, parents' answers seem to strengthen the idea that questions and learning are linked. So children hear about the link from about from their teacher and their parents. But also, if you see here, parents also guide children's thinking about questions to new directions. For instance, what I mean by that is, for instance, it is a fact that we don't only ask questions because we want to learn things, but also out of interest, as the last example says, or out of love. So that was also really good for children. Those are the question games, some of the question games introduced by Iphigenia. They are taken by the literature. We borrowed them from Fisher. It's a really great book. If you want the reference, I have it at the end. The strange questions that children were talking about were the what if questions. What if plants, for instance, started to walk? What if you were really given 3 wishes? What if no one needed to go to sleep? And things like that. In how many ways we can walk, tie a rope, and all that. And then from a really nice book, the book Ask Me, Iphigenia created cards with questions, and those are some of the examples. How did your parents choose your name? What is your favorite disguise? How do you make people laugh? They were really great questions. They were really open questions and allowed all children to take part and say something. It's a great book. I recommend it. Here are some pictures. Those are the cards that Iphigenia created. This is an activity in how many ways you can walk. That was great. All children participated in that. It was really interesting that we had shy children who, started participating just because they wanted to answer the questions. And those are the cards with questions. This is reusing a box for something else, becomes the box of questions. Now, as observation continues, Iphigenia writes that questions seem to be part of children's everyday vocabulary now. It's very common to hear them saying, can I ask a question? Miss, wasn't my question clever? They want Iphigenia's confirmation that this was a good question. That was really funny sometimes. Nearly all children seem to understand the difference between asking a question and expressing a thought or making a statement. They can tell helpful from unhelpful helpful questions, from unhelpful questions. And this is also really clear in the show and tell context. They ask productive questions in every topic and theme. They work in the classroom now. I will show you an example from a project on bees. Question games have become a favorite activity in the classroom. They're creating cards nearly every day in their free time. So there's this whole pile of cards and it's getting bigger every day. And as they become better, which is very important on asking questions, they also seem more interested in getting an answer to the queries, and they get better at making suggestions to Iphigenia. So, we could ask that by, looking at a book, or we could ask so-and-so to give us an answer. And a really valuable moment of this phase is the realization, that children can now think of questions easier in different contexts and depending on their own interests. And I have an example of that in a minute. Those are the questions they asked during the B project. They had specialists coming into the classroom. So again, they prepare their questions. And I think you can see the difference, how fast do bees fly, how do bees swing. I think they were really productive questions. And here we have Ioannis, who uses questions in the context of his interest in mathematics. It was again in pre-time, and he goes to Iphigenia and he says that I would like to ask a question with numbers. So Iphigenia suggests, would like to ask it, you would like to create cards, and he started creating several cards for his classmates. He also writes the answer at the back of his class. Here are some examples, more examples of his cards. He wasn't stopping. And this was a critical moment for us because we felt that we had an example of, what we call a real question, a question that he wanted to ask, a question that was, something that was an interest of him alone. Phase 4, if you remember, this is the last phase, and this is the time when children are encouraged to reflect on their experiences and decide how they want to celebrate what they have learned about questions and question asking. And as the group has the habit of creating a book for their library after every project they do, it makes sense to them. They tell Iphigenia that they would like to do a book of questions. And she says that this is a good idea and asks them whether they would like, there's something else they would like to do to show others what they have learned. And this is when children say that they would like to create cards with questions for the classroom next year, the children in the classroom, next door. That is the book of questions translated. So they write, why do we ask questions? Those are some of their answers. We ask questions to think. We ask questions to become clever. How do we know that someone is asking a question? They now know that we need to see a question mark, that we also speak with a different voice. They didn't know that when they started. They haven't thought of that, but they didn't know they haven't thought of that. And what can people do to find answers to their questions? Read books, call an expert. That is the Greek version. So you can see, why they call it their own book. And those are some of the cards they created for their peers. For us, that was another exciting moment, because if you have a quick look, you will see that these questions are good questions, if I can call them like that, in the sense that they have answers, that they seem to take into consideration the other person, that there's an answer. So they're not any more questions as for the sake of asking, but also for the purpose of interacting with others. And as you can see also there, taking ideas from all the question games they had during the previous time. Now, let me summarize what we learned from this project. First of all, our research project confirms that while children pose questions from a very young age, the questions do not automatically guide their learning in productive ways. It confirms that helping young children ask effective questions is facilitated by a combination of factors. It's not just one or two things, in that sense. And also confirms that learning how to ask good questions is not an incidental process. It's a process that needs to be supported in intentional ways. What do I mean here, and that it's not an incidental process? Sometimes we think, as I said before, that if the environment is such that, provokes quick curiosity and has open-ended material, and all that, that questions will come up spontaneously, they will come on their own, but it's not like that. Children will ask questions, but after a point they might stop, or they might, keep asking the same questions. We believe that we were successful in supporting children to learn how to ask a variety of questions, open, closed questions, imaginative questions, but more importantly, purposeful questions. That is, questions that had to do with the topic they were dealing with what they wanted to learn or know or find out at the given moment. We noticed that while teacher as a role model was a helpful strategy for drawing attention to the value of questions, explicit instruction was the most supportive strategy of the two. And our study, we think, provides evidence that question games are another useful strategy for helping children see that questions open the door, as I say here, to learning more things and understanding better. We haven't thought of question games as another strategy, to be honest with you. If you remember, I said just two of them. And from our work, we now know that it's it's another powerful strategy. And it has to do, again, this is the value of play. And I think we shouldn't be surprised that that was the case. And we also observed that once they discover children, the use of asking for learning and feel more confident in doing the asking themselves, then they transfer the knowledge to different concepts, the contexts, to their play, their interaction, and as you see, the example with Ioannis. Now, if I was to summarize the lessons learned, I think, okay, it works. I will focus on four things. The first one is that while there are many good ideas out there and useful strategies in the literature for supporting student questioning, we need to select the ones we want to use, and we need to organize them, and we need to implement them purposefully. And that was a challenge we had in the project. When we started, we had really many strategies, and we were really ambitious in the beginning, but then we thought, no, we need to focus and decide what is it that we really want to do. Asking questions, the second lesson was that asking questions as a learning disposition needs to be practiced in stimulating environments. And these environments are not created in one day. And what I mean here is that while Iphigenia, as recorded in the beginning, if you remember, was doing most of the questioning, children in her classroom were familiar with inquiry-based learning. They had project approach, and they were used to be asked by Iphigenia, what you would like to learn about X, where can we find information, on Z. So those were familiar sentences to them, okay? So they were encouraged to look for answers. So it was the environments they had created before the project that helped a lot. It wasn't that the project, worked miracles. Children knew that she listened to what she was saying, and she knew that she respected them as independent persons. So, and I think, actually, if I can make a parenthesis here, I would say that if we go back to the social side of imitation, as I said, it is clear that children choose to imitate a person they felt comfortable with, a person they trust as a model. And I think that's what they did. That's why the teacher as a role model worked in Iphigenia's classroom. And again, as I said, the power of play, they seem to have played a critical role. So we learned that. And that's Iphigenia's words, actually, that once children get into the habit of asking productive questions, she wrote in her notes that emergent learning is there right in front of your eyes. They bring their queries, they bring their interests, so you have right there a list of interesting projects and activities for the whole year if one wants. And that's it for me. Thank you very much.
Hello, Maria. Thank you so much. That's been such an interesting presentation, and I have written lots of notes, and I'm sure that many of our participants will have done so as well, because the work that you've shared with us, as I said, is so critical for enacting Te Whāraki and being able to really encourage curiosity, question asking, and working theories. So I've got a couple of questions that we'll have some time for.
Yes.
One of the things that I would just like to clarify for our audience is when you talked about Iphigenia working with these children and things like the show and tell time, was that with the group of the full group of 23 children?
Yes. Yes.
Because I was thinking about that in the context of many centres in Aotearoa, of course, have these rather large group times known as mat times. But I have also seen teachers working with smaller groups of children. So I'm kind of guessing that if you had the chance to suggest an ideal group size, it might still be smaller than 23 as well. Would you like to just comment on a bit of a group size for a teacher to be able to do this kind of intensive work?
Yes. Helen, thank you for the question. It is a problem in Greece. Unfortunately, the child-adult ratio is not good. So it's very common for teachers, early childhood teachers, to have 23 or 25 children. And if one can have smaller groups, that's the best. And I mean, there are some very realistic concerns there. If you think it's very, for instance, having to wait for 20 other children to ask their question can influence, the whole conversation. So the context, it's a difficult context. And yes, but that was her context.
Absolutely. And I mean,
Yes.
many new entrant teachers here who may be amongst our group too would be having that kind of number. So yes, I think that's good for people to think about, because we often see in early childhood centres, 3 or 4 children with a group of 45, whereas they might be better to split up into that kind of 1 to 10 to allow the kind of work.
Absolutely.
Yeah.
It needed a lot of work from her. When you have big groups,
yes,
it needs a lot of work from the teacher. And I think that what helped a lot is her questions and try to help children focus on, on the other child, on other children. Yes, it needs a lot of work. You're absolutely right. Yes.
Yes, because of the amount of listening that's going on, as well as the questioning. So
yes,
absolutely.
Yes,
absolutely. I thought that was great. I loved all the material about how early on the children couldn't really distinguish between a statement and a question, because I've seen that as well. And all those strategies for shifting the thinking about that and the understandings were very interesting, and I know that people will want to follow up with that. One thing I noticed that you didn't have the opportunity to talk about so much was how they drew their questions. So I wondered if you would just like to talk a little bit more about that.
Yes. That was, well, thanks for the question. That was, we were influenced by Froebel's belief in symbols, and that is very, very important. And there we could see we could see in practice what the literature says about how symbols help children think, restructure their thinking. It's amazing. And I wanted to say, I mean, actually, I had it in mind, but I didn't know about time, that asking children to write or draw their questions before a visit is valuable in terms of giving children independence. What we used to do, like in my days, we were saying, for instance, Helen and Mr. So-and-so, Helen would like to ask you, and we were doing the asking. I've seen children holding their paper and being able to ask their own question, either because they could, remember from the symbols or because they could read. They were at the stage of being able to read. Yes, that was really important. And
so it became a really good prop for them to be able to remind them, as you say, and give them that confidence, because it's not always easy for children to stand in front of their peers and adults. Yeah,
exactly.
And it also
sorry, Helen, I interrupted you. Sorry.
No, you please finish.
No, I was about to say, even the two shy children we saw that having the paper, they could focus on the paper and they asked the question, and they haven't done that before. And I'm thinking that probably also standing, with your hands like that, and it's an awkward moment, but having a question, having something to, consult, then it's a different experience. Yeah.
And what was so clear through the presentation too was that importance of time, so that you've got that. We talked about that earlier together, the importance of 6 months to actually undertake this process, so that children can really, learn that difference between statements and questions, the value of thinking aloud. Loved all those examples of playful games. I'm sure people will go away with some great ideas, including being journalists. And it was clear that those one-to-one conversations with their parents had been really helpful as well. So thank you for giving us such a 4-lesson summary at the end too, to really bring the presentation together. And I'd just like to note for our participants that Maria is going to, not only will this presentation be recorded for you to review, but she's also going to write up her presentation for the first year's journal. So that will be another opportunity for people to see what happened in this project and access your references too. So thank you very, very much, Maria. We really enjoyed it. And I'll back to Justine.
Thank you very much. Thank you.
Kia ora, Helen, and thank you, Maria, for your presentation. You've given us lots to think about regarding how adults can support children's learning through helping them frame effective questions. And I certainly was just having some memories of my own about show and tell times at kindergarten and children trying desperately to come up with a good question. But how to actually support them in developing those effective questioning skills is so important. And I'm sure what you've shared this evening is going to really prompt lots of ongoing conversations amongst our early childhood seminar series community. So thank you so much for that.
Thank you.
We really do appreciate you sharing your time and your expertise, and it'll be very interesting to see what evolved further out of that research.
Thank you, Jacinta.
And
I hope it was helpful.
And we look forward to maybe welcoming you some point in the future. Finally, for everyone, if you want to share or revisit this really amazing presentation, please do check out our Early Childhood Seminar Series YouTube channel, and obviously keep an eye out for Maria's article, which will be coming up in our first year's journal later in the year. The recording of this seminar will be available in a couple of days, and we're looking forward to seeing you all again in May for a seminar with Associate Professor Carola Kleeman from the Arctic University of Norway. So keep an eye on your inbox for the flyer and registration information. So thank you again for joining us today, and we're going to close with karakia. E noi tātou. Kia tau te rangi Mārie o te rangi i tu. tu iho nei o papatuanuku I tākoto nei, e te tai au I awhi nei ki runga I a tātou, tihei, mauri ora. May the peace of the sky above, of the earth below, of the all-embracing universe rest upon us all. Behold, it is life. Take good care, everyone. Ka kite anō.